A metallic shriek echoed through the orphanage's halls. It pierced through the walls and through Eric's ears. He was wide awake now. A loud bang, as if someone had hammered against one of the walls, followed by rattling that seemed to draw nearer. Eric gripped his pillow tight. He opened his eyes. Anne had woken up as well. He figured everyone had, but most still pretended to be asleep. Anne looked back at him and pressed a finger against her lips and nose for him to be quiet. Something moved behind him. The new kid on the bed besides his. He'd have to turn to see him, but the rusty springs underneath the mattress could denounce any movement. Louise had been there for almost a week. Enough time for Jake to tell him the story, as he did when Eric arrived. He wished he didn't know. He wished he didn't have to. Long ago, that building used to be a children's hospital. It specialized in the treatment of bone diseases. The Glass Garden, as the local adults would pitifully call it, thanking God that their children would never know what life was in there. A child should know what it's like to fall and get back up, ignoring a bruised knee in favor of running free. There, a fall, for as harmless as it might look, meant long-lasting agony. At best, children there could draw. They could also sit still as a nurse read one of the few books they had. You see, the hospital struggled to receive funds from the city hall, as even mentioning it brought a somber tone that was best avoided during election debates. Treatment cost enough. Leisure was luxury. A nurse arrived. Her name had been lost, purposefully forgotten. They said she could see the garden as a child could. For her, it wasn't just a professional environment, but a cold, gray prison. First, she brought new books. No one cared about the same stories about bunnies and squirrels learning to share and wash their hands. She read about warrior princes and princesses, dragons that guarded bountiful treasures and adventures across the whole world. She taught them to play cards and board games. She would sit down and play with the children, and she would make them earn their victories because, as she insisted to other doctors and nurses, there was nothing wrong with their heads. One day, she brought a huge box of crayons. It took the whole week, but they drew on every wall in the halls and rooms. Beautiful landscapes, mountains and castles, where they reigned and dueled in tournaments. With a bit of help, they learned to knight themselves, and soon the children would call themselves Milady and My Lord. And sometimes, when something happened, she would visit their rooms. She would bring them tea and whisper magic words as they drank it. By the morning, they would feel a bit better. When she did that, they would heal quicker, almost like a normal child. One of her patients had it harder than most. He wouldn't walk when he first arrived. He could feel and move his legs, and they would surely hurt when it was cold, but they were too weak to support him. And he was too scared to do physiotherapy. The boy had had bad accidents before. She pushed his wheelchair for him through the halls, taking him wherever he wanted to go, and making sure he wouldn't be left behind by the quicker children. She would hold him standing up several times each day to prevent blood clots from forming in his legs. She didn't make him feel ashamed for crying when it was cold. She gave him enough confidence to start physiotherapy. She would help him during the sessions, whispering words he didn't understand, but with a passion he could feel, as he struggled to put more of his weight on his legs during the rail walk. With time, the boy could walk with the help of metal crutches and structures around his legs. His ventures through the iron gates of the Glass Garden were now because of his motivation to walk, and not because of the pain, which seemed to have diminished a lot. Another adventure and another proud hero in their small kingdom. She walked into the hospital one morning, and all seemed too quiet for a moment. Her colleagues greeted her as usual, but they barely looked her in the eye. She thought of asking what was going on, but it wasn't necessary. A wail came from the ICU, and her heart dropped. A doctor tried to hold her, saying something she didn't hear, but she ran straight past him and into the room. He lay there, crying like a hurt animal. His arms and legs were suspended by wires and held in place by Lizarov cages. Seemingly endless pins pierced into the boy's swollen skin. More nurses and doctors rushed in, and she was taken away from that sight as they administered as much morphine as they could. He was making progress, they said. He could walk a little better each day, but he got too confident. He had to use the bathroom during the night. He had tried to go alone. He slipped. They said it wasn't her fault. All of them had encouraged him to do physiotherapy. That was true, but she was the one who succeeded. She dedicated herself almost exclusively to him now. But there was little she could do. The boy couldn't move at all. The cages restrained every limb, and even eating hurt. She would read to him, give him sedatives, and pray, in her way. She brought him tea several times a day and held the straw to his mouth. The nurse whispered every word she knew, time and again. But the boy wouldn't get better. The staff noticed she had begun to limp through the halls. She tried her best to keep a smile in front of the children, but it was clear the nurse lived in her own cage now. The boy's arms would never be the same, but at least the pins had managed to keep them stable. His legs weren't so lucky. They might have to adjust them by breaking them again, putting them back in place and adding more pins. That way, he might walk again one day. She doubted he'd ever try. She tightened the silice around her thigh and went into his room. The tea he drank that night was denser. The nurse repeated the words, out loud, until she couldn't speak. She could feel her fingertips tingling with power. She had to try, but as soon as she laid her hands on his legs, he began to weep. The bone underneath the skin moved a millimeter. There had to be something she could do for him, and there was. He asked her the same thing he had asked ever since the fall. He asked her to make the pain stop. She told him a story about a brave knight who had traveled to a distant kingdom, and as she did, she slowly gave him morphine for the pain. He dozed off fast. The flask was empty, and her thigh bled by the time the story ended. Remorse fell like the executioner's axe. She tightened the silice, but that would never be enough. He had looked like an angel until she convinced him to put himself in risk. Though his spirit was now free, the cages and pins still restrained and pierced into his body. And she had thought her thigh hurt. It wasn't fair. Not yet. In that room, madness ensued. The sound startled the hospital staff. Something had hit the ground hard. They went outside and saw that they were wrong. She had fallen on the gate. The iron spikes impaled the nurse on a straight line that went from her stomach to her head. They knew what had happened on the very moment they saw the metal cages and wires around her limbs and the pins piercing her face. The worst part, however, was the rattling sound the cages made against the gate's bars as her body twitched. The glass garden, which already struggled to make ends meet before the incident, closed soon after. Most people agreed that it was for the better. The children could now seek treatment somewhere more appropriate. Besides, the place's atmosphere had been detrimental to the city, and the building could be used for something else. However, people didn't seem interested in opening a hotel with that history. So, it was decided that the many rooms and halls would now house orphans, like Eric, Anne, and the new kid. Louise had arrived that week from another orphanage. Jake had gotten some intel on him, and they all knew he'd be trouble. He had been transferred because he was constantly bullied. Despite being 12, he was a big crybaby and liked to play the victim to get attention. Something to do with losing your parents so early. Eric wouldn't know what it felt like. Crybabies meant trouble there, and they never believed the warnings. You see, some invocations are much simpler than repeating a phrase in front of a mirror. That's why, at the orphanage, no child should ever cry after sunset. Jake had told him the story, which they confirmed as soon as he got there, 5 days ago. That way he would have enough time to ask the other children and prepare. All seemed well, until minutes after it got dark that night. He put on a show of tears for the staff, telling them about how the other kids were tormenting him with scary stories. They were chastised. They never believed them. Adults couldn't hear or see her. Well, Eric knew Louise believed now. The rattling came from their room's wall now. She seemed to be drawn by the crying children. It had happened before. For as much as they took care, bruised knees and hearts still happened on occasion, and there were tears. She couldn't, however, perceive things as a living person would. One by one, the doors along the hall slowly creaked open, only to shut at once moments later. It was just a matter of staying quiet, not moving at all, avoiding anything she could perceive as a cry for help. Paralyzing fear helped with that. A metallic sound came from the doorknob. It turned with no rush. The door groaned as it began to move. He shut his eyes, cursing the moment he decided to go to sleep facing the door. He prayed with everything he had for it to shut. Steps came into their room, rattling along the walls, past Anne's bed. Eric held his breath. Something touched his bed sheets, cutting through the fabric. It moved up towards his leg. It felt like someone had pressed a scalpel against his calf. He bit his own tongue. It would cut through the skin if it moved, and then he would... Louise moved behind him. The springs underneath his mattress wailed. The blade against Eric's calf moved at once, and he let out a groan, but it didn't matter anymore. It jumped over Louise's bed, and the boy screamed for help. All the other children jumped from their beds and ran out the door. Eric looked back into the room as he fled, catching a glimpse of a dark and twisted thing held together by wires and countless metal spikes and pins over the new kid's bed. It moved frantically, cutting herself with her own spikes as its weight muffled Louise's screams. By the time the staff arrived, nothing remained. Not even a single drop of blood. All the evidence of what had happened was a small cut on Eric's leg, the twisted bed frame against a wall, and the torn-apart mattress all over the floor. The Iron Witch is a legendary ghost most known for her connection to metal and places where children went through great emotional suffering. It is said that she is drawn by their tears, hurting them amidst her own suffering and confusion before taking them away, leaving behind no trace. Her apparition is accompanied by metallic shrieks, bangs, and rattling as she moves towards her child. In our next venture into the Legendarium, we will continue our series on witches, researching the horrifying true crime story of the Sapolandia witch. Thank you for venturing into Obscura Scrolls. If you wish to keep updated with our latest findings, don't forget to like and subscribe so YouTube knows you're one of us. If you have intel on Genesis Obscura or anomalies for the Legendarium, let us know in the comments below. Stay vigilant, stay safe.